In the 1920s, no one symbolized industrial progress like Henry Ford. But what happens when the world's most powerful industrialist tries to conquer nature? Ford, armed with almost limitless wealth and ambition, set out to build a utopia in the Amazon rainforest, but instead unleashed disease, rebellion, and disaster. This is the wild, almost unbelievable story of Fordlandia, a dream of progress that became a nightmare. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. Henry Ford was a man who lived his whole life within a dozen miles of his birthplace on a farm at Dearborn, near Detroit, Michigan. He was narrow-minded and barely educated. Some claimed he was functionally illiterate. He didn't like bankers, doctors, alcohol, tobacco, pasteurized milk, fat people, war, laziness, tall buildings, college graduates, books, or Jews, especially the last one. According to Bill Bryson in his book 1927, once he hired a Hebraic scholar to translate the Talmud in a manner designed to make Jewish people appear shifty and avaricious. He brought a newspaper that published articles about the Jews conspiring to manipulate stock markets, overthrow Christianity, promote jazz, and encourage the wearing of short skirts. He was also the only American with a favorable mention in Hitler's Mein Kampf. But that wasn't all he disliked. In fact, he hated all barnyard animals. The cow must go, he said. In the future, farm animals of all kinds will be out. We don't need them. We will be better off without them. Instead of sheep's wool, he pushed linen made from flax. Soy milk would replace cow's milk. Indeed, he was obsessed with soybeans. He spent over $4 million on soy research. His labs figured out how to use it for paint, soap, diesel, gear shift knobs, light switches, glue, and cardboard, to name just a few. He had the body of a car made entirely of plastic, which was dubbed the soybean car. He made his workers eat soy biscuits and served guests soy banquets of soybean puree, soybean crackers, buttered green soybeans, soybean cheese, soybean bread with soybean butter, and soybean ice cream. Here he is, sitting in a field, in a suit made of soy fiber. But he had changed the world, and he was absolutely certain of his instincts.
If you had grown up in the period just after the 20th century began, you'd have thought that you lived in an era of unbelievable scientific and mechanical progress.
The mass production methods Ford introduced made the automobile the symbol of American prosperity.
The fruits of the Industrial Revolution had finally come to the people.
Together they gave you a new world.
Man was finally free from his shackles. The automobile was the crowning achievement of the era.
By 1924, more than half of all the cars produced worldwide were Ford's Model T. The story of Henry Ford in the Amazon starts in 1922, when Britain's Asian colonies floated the idea of forming a rubber cartel to control prices. Henry Ford, the world's biggest car maker and therefore one of the world's biggest consumers of rubber, was outraged. While he had forests and mines and foundries, rubber was the one important natural resource that Ford didn't yet control. So Ford set his sights on the Amazon. As we discussed in the previous video, the reason that plantation rubber in the Amazon had never worked was because of disease, specifically a parasite known as South American leaf blight, which spreads across the canopy of closely planted rubber trees. There was no South American leaf blight in Southeast Asia, which is why the British and Dutch plantations could flourish, ending the Amazon's first rubber boom in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Ford's adventure in the Amazon began with land. He secured a concession on the eastern bank of the Tapajós River, a big one, the size of Tennessee. It was half a continent away from the part of the rainforest where rubber grew best. The climate was too dry, the soil was too sandy, and large boats could only reach it part of the year. In 1927, he paid $125,000 for land that the state of Pará might well have given him for free. He was given tax and tariff exemptions by the Brazilian government, which didn't go down well in Brazil's press. Neither did the right Ford was given to run an autonomous bank, schools, and police force, which violated Brazil's sovereignty. On top of that, by the time Ford got a report back on the viability of his land concession, the economic rationale behind the entire project no longer held. The British cartel was falling over, and the high price of rubber had stimulated so much planting that the price was already on its way down. Ford's plantation idea, he was advised, made no sense. just buy the rubber on the market. But Ford was having none of it. This was to be Henry Ford against the Amazon, and Ford would win. And he wasn't alone in thinking so. Many Brazilians expected the richest man in the world to be successful and bring them along with him. Ford was famous around the world for his $5 a day minimum wage, and Brazilian eyes widened. And boy, did the Amazon need saving. In the 1920s, in the shadow of the rubber boom's collapse, the story of which we told in the previous video, the leftover inhabitants of the Amazon lived hard lives indeed. Outside of the handful of small towns, the people on the rivers were poor. There was no school for children, sickness was everywhere, and medicine nowhere. Most adult men were in debt. They were little better off than slaves, according to the reports that Ford read. These were men that Henry Ford had to save, and he would do that by paying them in cash, because there's nothing Henry Ford believed in more than in the transformative power of the fair wage.
He figured that a well-paid worker would be happier and more productive. It sounded like insane logic in 1914, but Henry was right.
What the people of the interior of Brazil need, he said, is to have their economic life stabilized by fair returns for their labor paid in cash. By the time Ford arrived, much of the river had been abandoned by the indigenous communities that had lived there and been replaced by poor mixed-race migrant families, forming an economy based on a little wildcat rubber tapping, subsistence agriculture, fishing, and supplying wood or working as crew on the riverboats. Ford's goal was to drag the benighted region, where cash was seldom used, into the industrial age. Modernizers in Brazil agreed with him that his model of industrial development could finally overcome the Amazon's poverty and backwardness and rescue the rainforest from the scrap heap of civilization. As the Washington Post wrote at the time, he wasn't just going to cultivate rubber, but the rubber gatherers as well. This was a part of the Ford myth. In the US, Ford employee Reverend Samuel Marquise captured the aura that had grown up around Ford when he said, "The impression has somehow got around that Henry Ford is in the automobile business. It isn't true. Mr. Ford shoots about 1,500 cars out of the back door of his factory every day just to get rid of them. They are the byproducts of his real business, which is the making of men." For Ford, the Amazon would provide a fresh start, free of bankers, politicians, and Jews. It was a quest for him, and it was personal, because he wasn't just trying to cultivate a commodity, he was trying to salvage a vision of America that was fast disappearing at home, an America he loved and that he had played a large part in burying.
The Model T was more than a motor car. It was the symbol of an industrial revolution. Even the grim depression of the 30s could not stop the powerful forces that had been set in motion.
It was Ford who had helped unleash the power of industrialization on American social life. And now, as Greg Grandin put it in his book on the project, he spent most of the rest of his life trying to put the genie back into the bottle. He was going to recreate this dream, and it would be named after him, Fordlandia. There were problems from the very beginning. For a start, there were about 75 or so families already living on the banks of the river inside the concession Ford had been granted, as well as a few small communities of indigenous Tupi-speaking people. They thought they could just evict them. They couldn't. Ford pressed on. The rumor had spread that Ford was going to pay tens of thousands of workers his famous $5 a day wage, and migrants from across Brazil's poverty-stricken areas descended on the work camps, trailing wives, children, and extended families. They built makeshift houses, and local merchants set up brothels, bars, and gambling houses. Venereal disease spread throughout the camp's bordellos. A Ford doctor who inspected one found that 7 of the 9 prostitutes had an active gynecological infection. They refused to treat them, hoping they would leave. One observer sent by Ford reported that it had become a mecca for all undesirables, even criminals, of the entire Amazon Valley. The families of the migrant workers further strained the overwhelmed health services. Many of the children suffered from malnutrition, parasites, and intestinal illnesses. Ford had become responsible for thousands of dependents. Fordlandia, rather than the model Midwestern settlement he had envisioned, became an Amazonian shantytown. Malaria, beriberi, and yellow fever were constant, and many workers died of pit viper bites as they bent to hack away the underbrush. On any given day, 100 men would be in hospital. There were ants, hornets, vampire bats, and jaguars, which occasionally would snatch babies from their hammocks. The maid of the general manager had her arm bitten off by a caiman and bled to death while bathing in the river. By the end of 1929, Fordlandia already had buried 90 people in the company cemetery. A year later, there were almost 300. By then, there were over 1,000 workers at Fordlandia, with more arriving every day from across Brazil. But they had a hard time just maintaining a workforce. Men would simply quit and leave without reason. Many didn't want to work during the dry season, the insect season, when disease was most prevalent. Many of these guys preferred the freedom of coming and going when they wanted to, being able to fish for their night's dinner or work seasonally so that they could spend part of the year tapping rubber or gathering nuts. Workers turned up expecting $5 a day and were disappointed to receive 35 cents. Even this was of limited use, as so much of the river economy worked on credit. Wages practically didn't exist on the river. If Ford paid too little, he wouldn't attract workers, but if he paid too much, then his workforce could just leave after they had earned enough to live for a couple of months. They had a 300% turnover rate, meaning they had to hire 6,000 people a year to fill just 2,000 jobs. So they had both the problem of losing too many workers and having too many workers show up, who, if they weren't hired, would just stick around anyway. Soon more than 5,000 people lived around the plantation with little infrastructure to support them. Fordlandia became the fourth largest city in the entire Amazon after Belém, Manaus, and Iquitos. By the end of 1930, Fordlandia had 4,000 employees. Most of them were migrants from Brazil's northeast, managed by Americans, Europeans, and skilled Brazilians. There were also a couple of descendants of American Confederates who had moved to Santarém after the American Civil War and never gone home. These guys were actually indispensable to the management, speaking English but knowing the local ways of the river. However, Ford still saw no reason that his formula that worked in the Midwest wouldn't work in the Amazon. Rejecting expert advice, he had houses designed in Michigan that were totally inappropriate in the jungle. The concrete floors were hotter than the dirt floors that many residents preferred. Instead of traditional thatch, they used metal roofs lined with asbestos that were hotter than the gates of hell, according to Fordlandia's priest. And this wasn't Michigan. This was the rainforest. The rivers around Fordlandia, for example, alone held more species of fish than all the rivers of Europe put together. Werner Herzog, speaking about making his 1982 film Fitzcarraldo, said of the Amazon,
"Of course we are challenging nature itself, and it hits back. It just hits back, that's all, and that's grandiose about it, and we have to accept that it is much stronger than we are. And nature here is vile and base. The trees here are in misery, and the birds are in misery. I don't think they sing, they just screech in pain."
That's what Ford was up against. But still, Ford tried to recreate a slice of the Midwest in the Amazon, with movie theaters, square dancing, and poetry recitals. He built a replica of a Michigan town with schools, swimming pools, sidewalks, fire hydrants, movie theaters, indoor plumbing, an ice factory, and bungalows on tree-lined avenues. It had electric street lamps, tennis courts, and dormitories for 1,000 men. He even made an 18-hole golf course, because Ford thought golf was good. And of course, there was the most iconic construction of all, the 150-foot water tower, what was at the time the tallest man-made structure in all of the Amazon. Prohibition wasn't a Brazilian law, but it was in Fordlandia. Because Ford hated cows, Fordlandia nurseries experimented with giving soy milk to babies. They instituted civic education and wholesome recreation that was decided in Michigan by Henry Ford, according to a vision of how he wanted the world to be. Ford tried to enforce his own rules, but with limited success. They tried to shut down the bordellos and bars, so their owners set them up on an island in the river. When they tried to evict the squatters, many of whom were the families that held legal title to the land before it was granted to Ford, they were forced to back down when protesters wielded machetes. They tried to keep the workers off the liquor boats that moored offshore and faced the threat of armed resistance. When they turned to the Brazilian authorities, they were told that prohibition was an American law, not a Brazilian one. The managers even struggled to impose time on Fordlandia. Most of the workers were used to working according to the rise and fall of the sun and the flux of wet and dry seasons. Weather was what decided the rhythms of life and had always determined the workday. Onto this, Ford was trying to enforce regimentation. This wasn't even a new phenomenon to Ford. In 1885, when Ford was 22, most of Detroit had refused to obey a law to unify time as the United States tried to switch over to the Greenwich Meridian. It took 20 years to get the city to completely abandon solar time and set its clocks back 28 minutes and 51 seconds to align with Chicago and the rest of the Midwest. Brazil itself resisted the switch for over a decade until accepting international time zones in 1913. Workers who had previously been poor but free resented the sanitation squads and medical teams that inspected the camp, draining pools and shooting stray dogs. These inspectors invaded homes to make sure toilets were kept clean and food was properly stored, and even that toilet paper was being used. The inspectors fined families that didn't keep their pigsties clean or who hung their wet laundry on the clothesline. Hundreds of babies were born each year at Fordlandia, and Ford doctors, who didn't think it was a good idea for women to give birth at home, made them go to the hospital. Then these children needed to be educated, so the Ford Motor Company was now running 7 schools. It was, as Grandin put it, an extreme version of cradle-to-grave capitalism. Ford was obsessed with regimentation, standardization, and measurement, all in the quest for efficiency. Workers were forced to work in the rain and in the heat of the day and only paid twice a month. Employees were forced to wear company badges with their ID numbers and had to pay if they lost them. Single men were housed 50 to a room in the bunkhouses. They were required to be vaccinated and take regular quinine against malaria in doses that made them dizzy and sick. They were fed a diet chosen by Henry Ford of oatmeal and canned peaches, rice and whole wheat bread, because that was Ford's idea of a healthy diet. It was all deducted from their pay automatically, so they couldn't choose where to spend their money. Each worker had to carry a small book like a passport that included their photograph, fingerprint, signature, and police record. And yet it was chaos. There were knife fights, riots, and strikes. In one of them, a group started chanting, "Brazil for Brazilians, kill all the Americans." They rampaged, causing $25,000 in damage, and the managers had to escape on a boat and wait for the Brazilian army to come and put down the revolt. The longer it took for the project to actually produce any rubber, the more it became less an economic project than a missionary one. What had Ford created there in the center of the world's biggest rainforest? Well, one morning I got up with my friends Leticia and Dan to go and find out. The road to Fordlandia is as clear a dividing line as you will see between the jungle and development of the Amazon. On one side is National Park. On the other are the farms, both beef and crops. Much of the land is cleared by burning, which is usually illegal but seldom enforced. You can still see the bleached bones of the fallen trees on the farmland that was until recently jungle. With a low population density, the majority of the traffic on these roads is commercial. To drive to Fordlandia is to see the modern transformation of the Amazon in real time. The better the roads, the faster the exploitation. Luckily, in the Amazon, good roads are never guaranteed. To get to Fordlandia, you leave the main road and head towards the river. Despite the energetic commerce in this part of the Amazon, there is little or no visible wealth in Fordlandia itself, or the lands around it. The people who live there, as far as I can tell, live quiet, humble lives. We get to Fordlandia as the sun is setting and a football game is finishing. In the dying light we can see the skeletons of Henry Ford's Amazon experiment in what is now a small town with a small town vibe. Where everyone knows everyone and people are outside socializing in safety until late in the evening. We take an evening stroll around the town, and one group of residents invites us in to come in and hang out. They are having churrasco, Brazilian barbecue, and a few beers, and playing a simple game with dominoes that Dan and I tried to understand, utterly without success. One of the men had just returned from work in the mine just down the road. Leticia lets the kids play with her head torch. It turns into a bit of a party. In the morning, a dolphin surfaces in the river as motorbikes buzz around town. Just as it was almost 100 years ago, the water tower remains the most striking feature of Fordlandia. Behind it you can see the mighty Tapajós, the 9th largest river in South America and the 12th largest in the entire world. From above, you can get a sense of the sort of community Henry Ford was trying to build here in the Amazon, and clearly many of his buildings were well made. After all, just like the people that he brought to this corner of the jungle, they're still here.
Tem que cuidar. Desce daí, filho, desce, vem.
Tourists aren't exactly frequent to Fordlandia, but they're not unheard of. It has a hotel, for example, and it wasn't unusual that we got a tour of some of the remaining facilities with our friends from the night before. Inside the structure, Fordlandia's residents have stacked much of the left-behind machinery and furniture sent all the way from America.
We can go up the stairs.
The people we met in Fordlandia were insistent on the fact that it isn't a ghost town, as is commonly said. It's alive and well and a great place to live. Many of them have grown up there. Others told us that they had actually moved to Fordlandia from other parts of Brazil because of its safety. It's their home. While the factories are still standing, the hospital is not. This overgrown floor is all that is left. Though not many, if any, people who experienced Fordlandia's heyday are still alive, I've read that elements of the experiment, like the free healthcare and the wages, are still remembered fondly. Many of the original bungalows are still lived in. Before leaving, we have some lunch. We only had time to stay for one night, which was unfortunate as Fordlandia is a pleasant place. We, however, had to head back to Santarém to continue our journey downriver. When we arrive back in Santarém, it feels dark and even a little menacing after experiencing the leftover tranquility of Henry Ford's experiment in the Amazon. So, how was the rubber going? Well, slowly. With all the disruption, by 1931 only 1,300 hectares of forest had been cleared, all by hand. At that rate, it would take 1,000 years to plant the entire concession. When they used local seeds, they proved inadequate. The clear-cut slopes of the plantation lost their topsoil in the rain, and the bare sun scorched the leaves of the seedlings. During the first 5 years of the project, there was not a single person with scientific training in either tropical agriculture or rubber cultivation, and they didn't think to ask the locals. But that was only the beginning of the problems. Clearing the forest canopy allowed algae to bloom in the creeks that ran through the estate, which increased the snail population, the vector for the parasitic worm that causes schistosomiasis, infecting people's intestines or urinary tract that can lead to liver damage, kidney failure, infertility, or bladder cancer. Until it appeared in Fordlandia, schistosomiasis had been unknown in the Brazilian Amazon. As mentioned earlier, wild rubber only grows a few trees per acre, spread out enough to keep infestation and disease at bay. The tree is a climax plant, meaning it developed in an ecosystem at the apex of its complexity, and it evolved with the jungle around it. And Fordlandia wasn't an ecosystem at the apex of its complexity. There is a reason that rubber plantations in the Americas had already been tried and abandoned. It worked in tropical Asia because while the climate was similar enough, the predators were not. But Henry Ford was not one for listening, and in Fordlandia they planted the trees close together. In 1934, they bought seeds from plantations in Asia that had been bred to be highly productive. By the end of that year, they had planted 1.5 million trees. But in 1935, the tops of the trees began to touch, which meant a perfect environment for South American leaf blight, which the Asian variety was especially vulnerable to. Soon, leaf blight spread throughout the plantation, and by the middle of 1936, Fordlandia was decimated, just at the point when it should have started exporting latex. So they decided to change the plan and establish a new plantation called Belterra further downriver, an even bigger version of Fordlandia with 800 houses and the attendant movie theaters and recreational halls and American streets. At this point, Ford had invested $7 million and still hadn't seen any rubber. At Belterra, they planted 5 million seeds and employed 7,000 people. And the same thing happened there. In late 1940, leaf blight turned epidemic. They tried top budding all 2 million trees, chopping each tree at 2 meters and grafting on branches of a more resistant variety. It took 600 workers 4 years to complete, but it was to no avail. If it wasn't leaf blight, it was caterpillars. Ford tried to beat the jungle, and he lost. In 1945, his grandson, Henry Ford II, who had taken over the company, gave up. By that point, they had sunk $10 million into the project and hadn't tapped any rubber. He sold both Fordlandia and Belterra to the Brazilian government for $500,000. Many of the workers didn't even know the Americans were leaving until the day they boarded the ship. And after all this expenditure and effort, Henry Ford never once visited Fordlandia. Undoubtedly, Fordlandia was a complete failure. However, in a touching irony, Ford was right about one thing. Though people don't use them very often to make suits, in 2013, Brazil became the world's biggest exporter of soybeans. In May 1951, the first shipment of latex from Singapore arrived in Brazil. Ever since that first shipment of foreign rubber, Brazil has relied on imported latex to meet its rubber needs. The rubber boom was over at last. So where are we with our story of the Amazon? Those indigenous peoples who had survived or escaped enjoyed a half-century of relative peace. With the rubber boom ending, the environment was safe for another 50 years. Once again, the Amazon would lose interest for outsiders. Medicine had moved on from the forest drugs that drove 18th century expeditions into the jungle, and metal ships didn't need wooden masts from Amazonian timber. Coffee grew better in southern Brazil, and rice, cotton and sugar were much better in the northeast, or better yet, the southern United States or Caribbean. What remained was small-scale fishermen and slash-and-burn farmers. Most of the population of the Amazon was now mixed blood, the first outsiders to adapt to the conditions of the rainforest. They had learnt many of the ways of the native Amazonians and replaced them on the banks of the main rivers. There was practically no agriculture nor roads. The rivers were the highways. As historian John Hemming writes, colonists and immigrants had decimated indigenous peoples with their diseases, guns, and oppression, but had proved hopelessly unable to combat the forces of nature and live sustainably in those teeming forests and rivers. So the natural world continued its exuberant and turbulent existence unmolested by man for a few more decades. At the end of this process, the Amazon was a radically different place. The indigenous population had been decimated, yet the environmental impact was relatively minimal. People had been trying to turn a profit in the Amazon for 300 years without sustainable success. Yet in the second half of the 20th century, that would begin to change. The next video in this series is about the environmental challenges the Amazon faces and the human societies that live here today.